Howka everyone, I'm Angelina, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Imperial Valley Desert Museum. Today, two of our education specialists and I will be diving into how tribal governments were formed, function, and how they are recognized by the United States federal government. We will be exploring these topics by focusing on the Kumeyaay and fellow indigenous tribes in the United States of America. The Kumeyaay are the indigenous people that have lived and currently live in San Diego County, Imperial County, and Baja California, Mexico for over 10,000 years. The Kumeyaay, along with other indigenous tribes, have practiced their own forms of tribal sovereignty and solidarity for thousands of years prior to European contact, permanent settlements, and the formation of California as a state within their traditional territories.
Auka, I'm Luis, and I'm one of the education specialists at IVDM. There are 573 federally recognized indigenous tribes in the United States, and each one has the right to make their own laws, govern themselves and their lands. This concept is known as tribal sovereignty.
The relationship between the federal government and federally recognized tribes is a relationship between two governments. Although tribal sovereignty is defined by the federal government, tribes now have the ability to participate and consent over any decisions regarding their citizens and their land. The relationship between native tribes and individual states is set forth by the federally recognized tribes. States have no authority over tribal governments unless it is clearly authorized by Congress. Federally recognized tribes have the right and authority to conduct themselves and their lands independently from state government control. Indigenous tribes have existed as sovereign governments for thousands of years prior to European settlement and the founding of our nation. Solidarity refers to the unity they have demonstrated towards one another based on community interests. Upon the arrival of the Europeans, indigenous people began to see the transfer of their land, use of their resources, and the challenging of their culture and tribal sovereignty.
After European settlement, indigenous lands were transferred to the Mexican government and then to the U.S. government. Following the Mexican-American War, modern determination of tribal sovereignty lay in the hands of the U.S. government.
Auka, I'm Charles. I'm one of the education specialists here at IVDM. Early history of American tribal sovereignty was influenced by three Supreme Court cases, referred to as the Marshall Trilogy.
John Marshall was the longest-serving Chief Justice in Supreme Court history. His Supreme Court case decisions have provided the framework for federal and indigenous relations. The first case of the Marshall Trilogy was Johnson v. Emmentosh in 1823. This case primarily related to land issues and the interpretation of the doctrine of discovery in the United States. The doctrine of discovery was a concept that allowed the transfer of indigenous lands to dominating groups, like the transfer of lands from the Europeans to the Mexican government and the American government. The case involved Thomas Johnson and William Emmentosh. Johnson purchased land from the Piankashaw tribe of Ohio. Emmentosh later obtained a deed to the same land from the U.S. federal government. The court sided with Emmentosh and decided that, although native tribes were allowed to occupy their land, they couldn't claim land rights, and ruled that only the federal government could renegotiate with native tribes over land rights.
The second case was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. In 1828, the Cherokee Nation went to the Supreme Court seeking federal protection and assistance from the state of Georgia.
The Cherokee Nation wanted protection of their lands from laws that violated previous treaties established by the U.S. government and to be recognized as a foreign nation. The court ruled that the Cherokee Nation did not constitute as a foreign nation, but was instead recognized as a domestic dependent nation.
A domestic dependent nation is a distinct political community, but one that is still subject to the U.S. government. The case was dismissed, and as a result, the absolute power to regulate tribes and their lands was left to the U.S. government.
The third case in the Marshall Trilogy was Worchester v. Georgia in 1832.
Samuel A. Worchester was a white Christian missionary living in Cherokee Territory in Georgia. To deter Worchester and other missionaries, the state of Georgia passed a law that prohibited preaching on Cherokee lands without a state license. This resulted in Worcester's arrest, as well as several other missionaries. Worcester appealed to the Supreme Court. The court sided with Worcester and agreed the state of Georgia had no right to extend its law on Cherokee territory. This case once again established that the federal government, not the states, had authority over indigenous affairs. These cases demonstrate the complex issues that surround tribal sovereignty and its ever-changing description, where it once resided with the tribes themselves and then the states. Tribal sovereignty today is a conversation limited between two distinct nations. What does tribal sovereignty look like today for the Kumeyaay and other tribal nations we have here locally? Well, let's turn it over to Angelina, who will fill us in.
San Diego County features the largest number of tribes and reservations of any county in the United States. There are 18 federally recognized tribal nation reservations and 17 tribal governments. These reservation lands, which are governed by tribal nations, total approximately 127,000 acres, or 198 square miles. That's approximately 96,000 football fields. Now that's a lot of land. 13 of the federally recognized tribes in San Diego County are Kumeyaay. The United States sovereign Kumeyaay bands are Viejas, Sequan, Barona, San Pascual, Inaha Cosmet, Capitan Grande, Santa Isabel, Huiapai, Manzanita, La Posta, Jamul, Mesa Grande, and Campo. Most modern tribal governments have their own constitutions and are organized with elected members that serve on a tribal council to oversee tribal affairs. Although many tribal governments operate similarly, they vary in number of their tribal members and the basis of their operations. Let's look at some of the local Kumeyaay tribal nations and how their governments function. The Campo Band of the Kumeyaay Nation is governed under the authority of the Campo Constitution passed by a tribal committee on July 13, 1975. Under the Campo Constitution, the lawmaking authority for the band is exercised by a general council composed of all adult members aged 18 years and older. The Barona Band of Mission Indians is governed by a general council composed of approximately 240 voting members of the tribe. The General Council meets monthly. In addition, there's a tribal council composed of 7 elected tribal officials. Another branch of the tribal government is the Barona Gaming Commission, responsible for regulating casino activities. The Sequan Band of the Kumeyaay Nation is governed by the Tribal Council. Tribal officials include a spokesperson, a vice chairperson, a secretary, and a treasurer. These elected officials determine and administer laws, conditions, and regulations by which tribal members are to comply. Tribal council members must be over the age of 18 in order to run for office. Members serve a 4-year term, and all tribal members over the age of 18 are eligible to take part in the election process. Sequan's tribal council oversees the business operations of the tribe, as well as ensures the health, welfare, and safety of its tribal members and the surrounding community. Tribal governments and tribal sovereignty are often defined by their independence from the U.S. federal government and law. Here in Southern California, some tribal governments only oversee tribal affairs. Others include gaming affairs, and others oversee a wider sense of affairs. But how do these many independent and sovereign tribes work and interact together?
Pan-tribal organizations exist to create a sense of unity within tribes. The Kumeyaay Heritage Preservation Committee, KHPC, work with a number of other pan-tribal organizations in order to protect traditional lands, heritage, and to secure a better future for the Kumeyaay.
Individually, each organization is dedicated in its service to specific elements of indigenous heritage and lands. Collectively, they serve to advance and secure an understanding and the preservation of the past for the future. The Kumeyaay Dequeño Land Conservancy, KDLC, is a non-profit organization that dedicates itself to preserving and protecting environmentally and culturally sensitive lands within the Kumeyaay's traditional territories. The Kumeyaay Cultural Repatriation Committee, KCRC, was created to assist the San Diego bands of the Kumeyaay in the repatriation of their ancestors' human remains, tribal artifacts, and cultural objects.
With these organizations working together, the rich 10,000-year history and culture of the Kumeyaay can continue to live on.
Today, we explored how tribal governments were formed, function, and why they matter, and how they are recognized by the United States government. Currently, the Kumeyaay and other indigenous tribes have regained some of their rights and continue to do so, with the government taking a more supportive approach to tribal sovereignty. Presently, tribal sovereignty and solidarity have helped to secure and affirm the independence once held by the nation's indigenous peoples. Under their own tribal leadership and supporting organizations, the Kumeyaay and other tribal nations work to protect and restore their traditional languages, culture, and traditional territories for generations to come.